I think most people here know me. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign. And the topic of this forum is one that, nobody wants to talk about, as I said a few minutes ago, which is the plans that the MAGA movement and Trump and his supporters have to overthrow or steal the election in the event that they lose. So obviously for us it's a really serious topic, but in the aftermath of the hoopla and the flag waving and the hype of the Democratic Convention, people who are completely opposed to Trump don't even want to think about that. It's going to be fine. It's in the bag. The Democratic lawyers have got this, but we're not so sure about that. So anyhow, John's going to give a presentation of about 20 minutes.
About 25, I think.
Yeah, that's fine. And then we'll have a full discussion about what's going on and what, if anything, can be done or should be done.
So I want to start just with this short video.
You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed, it'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. I love you, Christians. I'm a Christian. I love you. Get out. You gotta get out and vote. In 4 years, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good you're not gonna have to vote.
LBC, we got any patriots out there tonight? You hear me? God is on our side.
The night before the January 6th insurrection, Block preached at Freedom Plaza in Washington, D.C.
I don't know about you, but I ain't packing up, slacking up, or shutting up until I've been taken up by the glory of God. If you believe that, patriots, say amen out here. We're a mighty army.
If that side loses, it is going to feel as if God's will has been thwarted.
I'm telling you, we need lions to take back this republic so America's going to remain a Christian nation.
Christian nationalism is a term that in recent years has been used to describe a political ideology that fuses patriotism with Christianity. Experts use the term to describe a group of people who believe America was founded as a Christian nation that needs to be restored to its Judeo-Christian roots. About 20% of Americans strongly embrace Christian nationalism.
Of God, as they interpret it. Trump supporters are increasingly overt in their calls to replace democracy with a MAGA theocracy.
If 10 years ago, you had told me that we'd be seeing scenes like what we just saw in this video, I'd have said you were being hysterical. And I learned something from that. But still, in reviewing what I'm going to present this morning, I had to ask myself again if I was at least exaggerating the extent of the danger. This video should serve as a reminder of what is possible. And Trump and company have also learned something from January 6th. They learned that a direct, violent coup was not possible. So they had to lay different plans. So what they've been preparing for the last 4 years is a coup with a legal or constitutional cover. That is what the recent Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity represents. In that ruling, the MAGA majority on the Supreme Court just simply made up what amounts to a new law out of whole cloth, that the President of the United States is above the law, that he can do whatever he likes, and is not subject to legal prosecution. In other words, this legalizes the overthrow of the rule of capital through democracy. The owners of capital in the U.S. have ruled through democratic means ever since the Civil War ended nearly 160 years ago. It's been the most successful such rule in history. So the questions that we have to ask ourselves are, number one, how did that base develop to overthrow bourgeois democracy? And how did capitalists like Yarvin, Thiel, and Elon Musk develop such enormous conceit that they came to view the overthrow of this 160-year method of rule as actually possible and even desirable? Second, what exactly are the means through which they intend to carry out this constitutional coup? And finally, third, what are some of the possible outcomes of whether the coup succeeds or not, and what can we do about it? What I'm not going to get into is whether the outcome matters very much. Anybody who's not living in an alternate reality knows the answer to that, as this video we just watched shows. Now, normally, we think of the establishment of authoritarian rule as happening when there's a crisis in society, when the working class is actually challenging the rule of capital. But I think that just the opposite is true in this case. Here is where that proverbial horseshoe concept comes into play. You have the opposite ends of the spectrum leading towards the same result. I think that what we have is an enormous crisis in the US working class. And incidentally, we're not the only country with such a crisis. We've had a nearly 80-year war against all the best traditions of struggle of the US working class. And a leading force in that war has been every wing of the leadership of the US working class, which is to say the union leadership. They have brought all the propaganda of the capitalist class directly into the mass organizations, the only mass organizations that workers have ever built in the US, the unions. They have succeeded in alienating the vast majority of union members from their own unions. The union leadership has buttressed the capitalist propaganda of individualism, which is the exact opposite of working class solidarity. All this has created utter confusion within the working class. The non-profiteers, of course, have also played their part in all this. Now, normally, a certain tension exists under capitalist democracy between the drive of the capitalists to complete domination as opposed to the resistance of the working class and the oppressed, the latter of whom must ultimately depend on support of at least a major sector of the working class. But what happens when one side fragments, when the working class no longer is any sort of independent power? Then a vacuum develops, and something must fill that vacuum. That is what the forces of the potential coup represent, a drive to fill that vacuum. The rise of the far right and its support from a small wing of the US capitalist class does not result from a threat to capitalism from the working class. On the contrary, it results from the crisis of confusion and fragmentation in the working class. This crisis has created So Donald Trump discovered when he was president that he could not get the military tops to carry out a coup. On two separate occasions, he wanted the generals to call the troops out into the streets. And on both occasions, the top generals made it clear that they would not obey such an order. So Trump and his MAGA leaders tried to overturn the elections by the legal route. But it was unplanned. It was an unplanned hit or miss plan, and it crumbled like a house of cards, just as did the January 6th attempt at a violent coup, which also was hardly planned. So since then, they've had 4 years to organize and refine their plans and to seize complete control over one of the two main capitalist parties, the Republican Party. Now, before I get into their known plans for a constitutional coup, I have to mention the plans that probably exist beneath the surface, plans for a violent terrorist attacks on voting centers and on places where the votes are counted. I think the video that I showed demonstrates that such plans most likely are in the works. Trump and MAGA discovered that an outright frontal attack like January 6th won't work. They also found that there's a real risk of infiltration, like what happened when these types planned to kidnap and murder the Democratic governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. So they went into a decline after January 6th, but they also reorganized themselves. One of the foremost groups is the American Patriots 3%ers, or AP3. 3%ers, by the way, refers to, they talk about it was only 3% of the population that carried out the American Revolution. So the AP3 is already active on the southern border, quote, rounding up immigrants. AP3 has connections with various sheriffs and police and law enforcement members. The New American Journal quoted one of them as saying, quote, "The next election won't be decided at a ballot box. It'll be decided at the ammo box." And he said he's ready to force his way into voting centers if need be, or, quote, whatever it takes. A study by the Institute for Strategic Development shows that these terrorist groups have reconstituted themselves to make infiltration by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies more difficult. So we simply don't know what their plans are or what they might do. But we have to keep that danger in mind. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at their plans for a coup under legal cover. To get a glimpse of these plans, we should turn to what happened in Fulton County, Georgia, in the May 2024 primary election. Fulton County, of course, is the county in which Atlanta is located and is the absolute epicenter of the Democratic vote in Georgia because it contains the great majority of Black voters in the state. If the Democrats are to have any chance to win the state, they must get a huge majority in Fulton County. And something peculiar happened in the May primary in Fulton County. One of the election board members, Julie Adams, refused to certify the vote. Now remember, this was a statewide primary, which would just simply determine which two candidates would be in the November runoff for state office. It had nothing to do with the presidential election or even the presidential primary, which had been held in March. So why would Adams refuse to certify the vote? The answer is to be found in understanding who Julie Adams is. She is the state head of the America First Policy Institute, the AFPI. This is a multi-million-dollar institute tied in with Trump and with such foundations as Judicial Watch, which has done so much to enable MAGA to take over the judicial system. And Adams' refusal to certify the vote in that key county for the state, a swing state, and possibly the nation, was a test run for the federal election. Adams is not alone. According to Rolling Stone, some 70 election deniers now serve on election boards in key swing states of Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. So we can count on the effort of Julie Adams to be repeated 50, 60, 70 times or more. This in itself can tend to overwhelm the system. Then, on top of that, we have had the harassment and threats of the election officials and just rank and file poll workers, those who actually count the ballots. According to the Brennan Center, 38% of poll workers have reported such harassment and threats of violence, including threats to their lives and the lives of their families. This has caused massive resignations and retirements, and as a result, over 25% of those who will be administering the elections will be doing so for the first time. The result of lack of experience can be seen in one simple mistake. In the 2020 election district of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, poll workers simply didn't have enough paper of the proper thickness on hand, and this led to an hours-long delay in voting. That, of course, led to all sorts of wild conspiracy theories. Now multiply that by scores of times over, and you get a sense of the chaos that can result. You get a sense of the excuses the election deniers can seize upon to refuse to certify the vote. Now, we should not get carried away here. Again, according to the Brennan Center and others, certification of vote results is not optional. The election boards are not created to interpret the law. They're not created to decide if votes are legitimate or not. Their role is purely to serve as human adding machines. In other words, just to count up the number of votes for which candidate in the election which they are dealing with. And in all of the 60 plus court cases arising from the 2020 election, the courts ruled fairly quickly against the challenges. But such challenges can create a climate, a base for further challenges. Nor can we rule out the possibility that an entire local election board would refuse to count the votes. Normally, we can expect the courts to resolve this fairly quickly. That is not necessarily true in 2024, as we will see. In 2022, the Presidential Electoral Count Reform Act was passed. That act provides for quick federal court action in case of disputes of election results. In other words, disruptions by election denying officials. It also provides for a means of preventing individual rogue federal judges, like, for instance, Eileen Cannon in Florida, from playing a role. It also provides for quick resolution by the Supreme Court. But here a question arises. The act provides for a key role to be played by the state's governor. That would seem to fly in the face of an extreme legal theory called the independent state legislature theory. This theory claims that the state legislatures are the one and only authority in everything to do with running elections, including determining its outcome. Now, in 2023, the Supreme Court ruling in Moore versus Harper, the Supreme Court majority rejected that legal theory. But in Justices Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch dissented. They, in effect, accepted the independent state legislature theory. Since then, the rest of the MAGA injustices, most especially Chief Injustice John Roberts, have gone further down that road. That's what we saw in the ruling that a president, meaning Trump, is immune from criminal prosecution for any so-called official act. To repeat, there's absolutely nothing in the law or in the Constitution that justifies this ruling. They, in effect, simply created a new law. In the past, Roberts was concerned that the court would retain some degree of credibility, that a majority of the public would see the court as being above politics. This ruling was a declaration by him, this immunity ruling, that he didn't give a damn how the court was perceived anymore. He sensed the MAGA victory, and that was that. So, whether the Supreme Court's MAGA majority could travel down that road of the independent state legislature theory after the coming election is an open question, and I'll return to that later. Now, as we remember, in 2020, the electoral count in Congress was challenged by a couple of senators and a few representatives. The Federal Electoral Count Reform Act tightens up the requirements to require 1/5 of members in each house for a challenge to be considered. I think it's pretty likely that there will be such numbers if Harris wins. For such challenges to succeed, the Republicans would need a majority in both houses. That was why Trump, after a several-week delay, held his first election rally out in Montana in early August. He is sure to win Montana by double digits, but there the incumbent senator is a Democrat, John Tester, and Trump was campaigning for his Republican rival. A key to overturning the election, should that be necessary for them, will be for the Republicans to gain a majority in the Senate, and the Montana Senate race gives them a good chance. Now, what is the Democrat strategy for preventing the MAGA Republicans from overturning the election and instituting a constitutional coup? A few weeks ago, liberal TV personality Rachel Maddow interviewed, quote, progressive Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren, and Maddow posed this exact question to her. Warren gave two answers. First is to run up the votes for Democrats all up and down the ballot, so the result is so overwhelming that they cannot overturn it. The second part of the strategy is to take it to the courts. It's not ruled out that the Democrats can get an overwhelming victory, but that is by no means assured. In fact, at this time, the result is very much up in the air. I think if the Democrats do gain an overwhelming victory, that will intimidate the election deniers, including those on the election commissions. Many of them will back off from trying to overturn the election. Even the MAGA injustices on the Supreme Court would feel the pressure. To get elected, a presidential candidate must get at least 270 electoral college votes. What would happen if Harris got that number or only slightly more? I think that situation, which is entirely possible, would send the election deniers into overdrive. It's exactly such a contingency for which they are planning. It cannot be ruled out that so many challenges could be made at the county level, that the state boards could be overwhelmed and one or two could simply find it, quote, impossible to rule. All sorts of delays and confusions are possible. The MAGA majority on the Supreme Court is waiting for that, like a fox waits for the gopher to emerge from its hole. It's impossible to predict exactly how court challenges could reach the Supreme Court or what the pro-MAGA decision the majority could reach. Another route for a legal coup would be this. If Harris wins a slim majority of electoral votes, then because of the electoral math, it's most likely that the Senate will swing Republican. Because of gerrymandering, the House could stay in the Republicans' grip. In that case, and if the vice president, who is Harris for the moment, declares a Democrat victory, it's certain that the results from at least that come from at least one state would be challenged. The challenge would be to the results in one particular state or a series of states, maybe Wisconsin, for example. In that case, it's most likely that the challenge would win in both the House of Representatives and the Senate if the Republicans have a majority in both houses. And keep in mind, all the Republican majority has to do is deprive the Democratic contender of the majority of potential electoral votes. They have to get, one candidate has to get at least 270 electoral votes. If there are enough states that cannot send in electoral votes by January 6th, so that neither candidate gets a majority of all the 538 electoral votes, then the House of Representatives chooses the next president. Each delegation from each state gets one vote. It doesn't matter if the delegation has 2 delegates, as Montana has, or 52 delegates, as California has. Each delegation gets one vote. And since the majority of states are rural, and the MAGAists are in the majority in those states, it's certain that the House of Representatives would install Trump. Or they would if the Democrats' game plan, as outlined by Elizabeth Warren, among others, is adhered to. That's where the movement from below comes in. A popular Black Instagrammer in Atlanta, Talia, who has some 25,000 followers, was asked on Instagram what Black people in Atlanta would do if the Republicans try to steal the election. Her answer was succinct. They're going to riot, she wrote. It seems pretty certain that there would be mass protests in the country. In fact, that could happen even before the election if the fascist groups conduct terrorist attacks on voters or on Black and Latino populations. What would be the response of the Democrats and their fronts, the NGOs and the union leadership? We know that in 2000, they did their best to prevent protests in Florida from the stealing of the election down there. In 2020, the Democrats carried out the same legal-based strategy. And that's exactly what Elizabeth Warren is advocating for today. So if Harris wins, I think there would be a crisis inside the Republican Party. Hundreds of Republican officials would suddenly discover that they never did support Trump. Already we see signs of that, such as the several Republican speakers at the recent Democratic convention. And the Democrats are hoping to return to the whole bipartisan monopoly that already is on its deathbed. Of course, if Trump and Vance get in, then all bets are off for what might happen, as Cheryl showed in her presentation on August 4th. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what role can those who understand the extreme danger of MAGA and a possible MAGA coup play? What role can we play? And right now, I think the overwhelming mood of those who want to fight MAGA is just to elect Harris and the Democrats and hope for the best. If the Democrats get in, they are sure to disappoint many millions. And if they don't, MAGA will feel enormously empowered and become even more aggressive. No matter what the outcome, MAGA is not going away, and in fact, increased violence from groups like AP3 I think, are likely, and the Democrats will prove once again incapable of dealing with it adequately. I hope that that will lead to a transformation of the mood amongst at least a sector of the working class and working class youth, and that is what we have to look for. It seems to me that the unions have to be at the center of such a resistance, but the union leadership will be reluctant at best to act. So central to any plan is to find some union members who might be willing to bring it up inside their unions and in their workplaces. The goal could be for the unions to organize a meeting of all union members and supporters to discuss this danger and what the unions can do to counter it. Maybe we can start discussions around this in our communities and or in schools, and through that, find the ones and twos of union members. Through that, MAGA resistance committees could be built. Such committees absolutely must be organized democratically with regular meetings and an elected leadership. That way, no matter what the outcome of the November elections, the beginning of a working class-based movement could develop. That is one possible avenue of approach for now. As events proceed, who knows what will develop? For example, if there is a terrorist attack, that could lead to events in a very different direction. But either way, we have to start looking for ways of organizing now and be prepared for the unexpected. Thank you.